They said the coal would blink first. They laughed at the idea that weather could stall an army built on gears and willpower. The maps in headquarters showed only straight arrows. The margins left no room for frost. Tanks had carried them through Poland, France, the Balkans. Steel that never hesitated, engines that started with a touch and purred like certainty. Then the campaign rolled east onto a continent that measured distance in seasons, not in miles, and the first pre-dawn wind bit through tarpaulins like teeth. Mechanics kicked at starter levers that snapped like twigs. Fuel lines turned milky. Batteries that sang in September died without a sound. The generals still smiled for the cameras. At the front, men lit straw under crankcases and prayed. No one had planned an autumn that would not end. Lubricants in the panzers were the wrong grade. Thin in summer, stone in winter. Water, because antifreeze had seemed a luxury, sat inside radiators that would split at -20 as neatly as wood under an axe. Gearboxes with proud tolerances seized because metal that perfect leaves no room for cold. The orders said to advance at dawn. Dawn arrived, the engines did not. A captain near Kalinin sent a message that read like a fable. 30 tanks unfit at first light, none touched by shell fire. He added a line his training had not prepared him to write. The frost is stronger than our armor. Across those fields, the enemy's machines behaved like natives. Diesel in the T-34 thickened slower. Wide tracks rode the crust instead of digging graves. Crews in quilted jackets moved with a patience learned from winters that did not negotiate. German drivers learned new rituals. Drain coolant at dusk, refill at dawn, keep engines idling all night and spend tomorrow's fuel today. Strike the sump with a mallet to loosen oil that moved like tar. Sometimes a tank caught, with a cough, a roar, a hope, and then tore its own transmission apart as if the cold had reached inside and clenched a fist. Headquarters called it temporary. The men called it something older. Rasputitsa mud froze into corrugated iron. Every rut became a vise. Narrow tracks carved trenches they could not climb out of. Rubber tires turned to glass and cracked. A field workshop near Klin improvised a chemistry of survival, kerosene whisked into grease, alcohol into radiators, rags around breech blocks to keep ice from welding them shut. Success looked like an engine idling without dying for 20 minutes. Failure looked like silence that rang in the bones. And still the arrows moved on paper. Hold this line. Reach that river. Take the city whose name bit at German tongues. But maps do not mark the way breath freezes onto a firing pin or how a starter handle can break a man's knuckles and his spirit in the same second. In the blue dark before sunrise, a battalion stood in a white field, listening to distant guns they could not answer, because their tanks would not start. Somewhere behind them, in a warm room, the laughter of summer still echoed on polished floors. Out here, steel learned humility from air. By December 1941, the laughter had stopped. The front was no longer a line on a map. It was a frozen graveyard stretching hundreds of kilometers, marked by tanks half buried in snow and soldiers wrapped in curtains, burlap, anything they could find. The German army that had raced across Europe was now standing still, motionless not by choice, but by the cold hand of nature. The narrator's voice would tell it slowly, deliberately, as if to let the frost seep into every word. The temperature had dropped below -40. Oil turned to wax. Fuel froze in its drums. Men carried torches beneath the bellies of their panzers, trying to warm the engines with open flame, the glow flickering against steel marked with frost. Those who stood too close went blind from the glare reflecting off the snow. Those who stood too far simply froze. One mechanic wrote in his journal, "We fight the same battle every morning, not against the Russians, but against the weather." He described how men took turns kicking the starter levers until their boots cracked, how spark plugs shattered like glass. The tanks, he said, made noises like dying animals. And when one finally started, its engine howled, not from power, but from pain. Every tank crew became a desperate band of improvisers. Some mixed vodka into the coolant to keep it from freezing. Others urinated on the engines, laughing bitterly as steam rose like ghosts. Soldiers stole blankets from civilians, fuel from officers, even machine oil from broken aircraft. Discipline gave way to survival, The cold had become the true commander. Reports reached Berlin, but they were softened. Official communiques spoke of temporary mechanical challenges, of weather-related slowdowns. The truth was far uglier. An entire armored regiment near Moscow had immobilized itself in a single night. The order to advance at dawn came, as always, but no engines answered. The officers stood in silence, hearing only the creak of ice. Meanwhile, the Red Army moved. Soviet troops wore felt boots, fur caps, and padded coats, clothing mocked by German officers just months before. Their tanks, the rugged T-34s, seemed born from the snow itself. Wide tracks skimmed over drifts that swallowed the German machines whole. Their diesel engines rumbled alive even at dawn, a sound that to German soldiers was worse than artillery, the sound of something that still worked. At headquarters, the high command argued. Some called for retreat. Others insisted victory was near. Hitler himself refused to hear the word withdrawal. His map still showed arrows pointing east. He demanded movement. But on the ground, movement was a fantasy. A panzer division that had once crossed France in a week could now barely crawl a kilometer in a day. The narrator might have whispered then that the front was no longer made of men and machines, but of will, and that even will can freeze. The winter had become an army of its own, invisible and merciless, killing faster than bullets. For every tank destroyed by enemy fire, 5 had died where they stood, cold, silent, and useless. By Christmas, officers wrote home not about victory, but about warmth. They prayed for the sun, they prayed for mercy, and most of all, they prayed that their engines would start again. January 1942. The frost had settled deep into the bones of the land, and into the hearts of the men still trapped within it. The snow was no longer soft or white, but hard as stone, glinting like shattered glass beneath a pale sky. The German front stretched thin and brittle, a frozen line of suffering. The tanks that had once thundered across Europe now stood silent, their guns rimed with ice, their crews huddled inside them like prisoners in iron coffins. The narrator's voice would draw out the image slowly, letting the desolation speak. Soldiers scraped frost from the inside of tank hatches with knives. The condensation from their breath turned to thin layers of ice that sealed the doors shut overnight. To open them, they had to kick until the hinges cracked. Engines were dead weight, frozen solid. The crews had tried everything, burning fires under the hulls, wrapping engines in blankets, mixing every kind of fuel they could find. None of it worked. One officer near Klin recorded that his men had dismantled the same Panzer engine 3 times in a single week. Each time they cleaned it, thawed it, reassembled it, and each time the cold killed it again. He wrote, "We have mastered machinery, but not winter." Winter is the better engineer. Fuel had become a ghost. Convoys from the rear froze in their tracks. Trucks overturned on icy roads or simply never arrived. Soldiers siphoned what little gasoline remained and stored it in their helmets, hiding it from superior officers. When it froze, they scooped it out like wax and warmed it over fires to liquefy it again. The smell of burnt fuel clung to everything. At night, the silence was worse than battle. No gunfire, no engines, only the wind moaning across the plains like a voice of judgment. Men slept in their tanks to escape the cold. But those same tanks became tombs when the fires went out. Whole crews were found seated upright in the morning, their faces pale and still, as if asleep. Meanwhile, the Soviets struck back. Their counter-offensive was not a grand charge. It was a relentless pressure, a slow grind that pushed through the German lines like an advancing glacier. The Red Army moved in white camouflage, invisible against the snow. Soviet T-34s roared past immobilized German tanks, their tracks spraying ice and contempt. The narrator would remind the listener that the German army's genius, its precision, was now its curse. The tolerances that had made their machines so efficient also made them fragile. The Soviet tanks, built with crude simplicity, thrived in chaos. Their engines rattled but ran. Their armor cracked but held. In one intercepted letter, a German mechanic confessed, "Their machines are ugly, but they live. Ours are perfect, but they die." It was an admission no one dared send to Berlin. In those days, survival meant abandoning pride. Crews stripped radios for insulation, melted snow in shell casings, and used gasoline-soaked rags for warmth. The frost had reduced the proud panzer divisions to bands of scavengers clinging to the shells of their machines. As January dragged on, even hope froze solid. No reinforcements came. No supplies arrived. The High Command's orders were written by men who lived beside roaring fires, not by those who slept beside dead engines. And in that vast white wilderness, the laughter that had begun the campaign was long gone, swallowed by the silence of a winter that refused to end. February 1942. The cold had become more than weather. It was a living force, an invisible enemy that claimed tanks, men, and morale alike. Across the endless whiteness of the Russian steppe, what had once been the spearhead of the German army was now a stranded host of broken machines. From above, it must have looked like a trail of corpses, iron and flesh mingled together, all frozen in time. The narrator's voice would slow, almost mournful. In villages burned and abandoned, German soldiers tore doors from hinges, furniture from walls, anything that could burn. Fires flickered beneath the shadows of tanks that could no longer move, warming crews who dared not admit that their machines were dead. The smell of smoke, oil, and frost mixed into something unforgettable, a scent of defeat the men would carry for the rest of their lives. In the frozen forests around Vyazma, an entire panzer regiment disappeared, not from enemy fire, but from mechanical death. The engines failed first, then the transmissions, then the men. Those who survived retreated on foot, leaving behind the beasts of steel that had carried them across Europe. Their commander reported bitterly, "The tanks will start again in spring, perhaps." If any of us lived to see it, the Soviets, meanwhile, advanced with grim patience. Their tanks moved steadily across the snow, their engines humming like the pulse of the land itself. For them, winter was not an obstacle, it was an ally. They knew how to move, how to eat, how to fight in this climate. German soldiers watched, numb and disbelieving, as T-34s rolled past the places where their own panzers had frozen solid. And still, Berlin refused to believe. Hitler sent new orders that demanded offensive action. "Push forward," the command read, "whatever the cost." But the cost had already been paid. At the front, officers burned the telegrams for warmth. They had no fuel, no ammunition, no functioning armor. Orders meant nothing when engines were dead and the ground itself refused to let go. One sergeant wrote in his diary, "We are no longer soldiers. We are witnesses. We have seen what it means to fight the earth itself." His words, found decades later, still carried the weight of frost and futility. The cold turned everything brittle, even courage. Rifles jammed, grenades cracked, water froze in canteens faster than it could be drunk. Frostbite consumed hands, then feet, then hope. Doctors had no morphine left. They carried saws instead. By mid-February, the dead were no longer buried. They were used as windbreaks. And yet the men endured. Because they were soldiers, and soldiers move until they can't. They kept watch beside tanks that would never start again, listening to the faint clicks of cooling metal like the last breaths of dying beasts. The narrator might have said that this was the moment when the myth of German invincibility truly ended. Not in a blaze of battle, but in silence. The laughter that had once filled the officers' tents in summer was gone, replaced by the crack of ice splitting steel. In that endless, frozen plain, the German army learned a truth no map could teach. That war is not only fought against men, but against time, against nature, and against one's own arrogance. March 1942. The snow began to change color. Where once it was white and pure, it now lay gray with soot streaked with oil and blood. The German front, if it could still be called a front, was collapsing into chaos. What had started as a campaign of conquest had turned into a frozen purgatory. Entire divisions were locked in place, not by Soviet guns, but by the cold that refused to die. The narrator's tone would deepen, reflecting the weight of inevitability. In every village, in every shattered barn, there were engines frozen solid, treads locked, barrels pointed uselessly toward the east. Mechanics, Men who had once been proud of their skill now looked like blacksmiths from another age, hammering at metal with fire and curses. Every clang echoed like a plea. The Luftwaffe could no longer fly. Snow clogged the runways and the fuel froze before it reached the wings. Supplies meant for the front sat trapped in endless convoys, their trucks abandoned, wheels encased in ice. A sergeant wrote home, "We are dying of stillness. Not one man has seen a moving tank in days." He wasn't exaggerating. When the sun appeared, it brought no warmth, only deception. The surface of the snow melted slightly, then froze again at night, sealing tools, weapons, and even bodies beneath new layers of ice. Men who fell asleep beside their tanks sometimes woke buried in frost. Others didn't wake at all. The Soviet counteroffensive, meanwhile, had gathered unstoppable momentum. Stalin's commanders understood that nature had done what their armies could not, halted the German advance. Now it was their turn to strike. Red Army soldiers, wrapped in white camouflage, swept across the steppe like ghosts. Their tanks, those rugged, simple T-34s, cut through the snow as if it weren't there. To the Germans watching, it was a nightmare. Their enemies moved while they stood frozen, powerless to respond. Every time a Soviet tank appeared through the blizzard, it was like seeing movement from another world, a world still alive. A German captain wrote, "They have engines that breathe. Ours are corpses inside Berlin," Hitler raged. He blamed his generals, his engineers, even the weather reports. He refused to admit that the winter had defeated his army before the Soviets ever could. The propaganda still spoke of victory, of temporary setbacks, of heroic endurance. But at the front, the truth was written in frost and silence. The narrator's voice would linger here, low and heavy. The once mighty blitzkrieg had stopped not with an explosion, but with a whisper. Steel had met its match in ice. Every man at the front now understood what arrogance had cost them. Yet amid the ruin, there were moments of humanity. Soldiers shared what warmth they could. Hands over small fires, coats wrapped around the weakest. They carved holes in the snow to shelter from the wind, laughed quietly at jokes that weren't funny, and dreamed of home. For many, home was a place they would never see again. As March dragged on, the frost began to loosen its grip, but the damage was irreversible. Hundreds of tanks lay ruined, their engines cracked beyond repair, their crews buried nearby. What the cold had not killed, it had broken. And so, when the first thaw came, it didn't bring relief. It brought the stench of everything the snow had hidden. The war was far from over, but its illusion of invincibility had melted away forever. April 1942. The thaw began, not with warmth, but with rot. The frozen rivers cracked, the snow turned to mud, and the ground that had held the German army still all winter now swallowed it whole. What the frost had spared, the earth began to consume. Tanks that had stood like monuments to failure now sank into the mire, their tracks buried beneath the muck, their engines coughing out black smoke before dying forever. The narrator's voice would describe it like a funeral procession for an army. The once proud panzer divisions that had rolled across Europe in thunder now looked like carcasses half submerged in the mud of Russia. The smell of thawing corpses, men, horses, and machines alike, filled the air. The land itself seemed to reject them. Soldiers tried to move, to regroup, to fight again, but every step was agony. Mud clung to their boots like chains, and what few trucks remained bogged down within meters of the road. Entire supply convoys disappeared beneath the earth, swallowed as if by some living thing. "We have conquered nothing but mud," wrote one officer near Smolensk. His words were short, bitter, final. The thaw revealed the price of winter. Rows of frozen bodies uncovered by melting snow lay beside tanks with their hatches open like mouths mid-scream. Horses still hitched to supply wagons stood rigid, glass-eyed. German soldiers, hardened by months of cold, began to break. They had no more illusions of glory. They had fought the elements and lost. Meanwhile, the Soviets pressed on with fresh determination. Their factories, untouched by war deep beyond the Urals, were producing tanks and guns faster than the Germans could destroy them. Every week, more T-34s rolled out, simple, rugged, unstoppable. Their crews were young and full of fire. To them, winter had been a test, and they had passed it. German command knew the truth but refused to say it aloud. Their engines were finished, their supply lines stretched to breaking, and their men exhausted beyond reason. Yet orders still came. Advance, hold, attack. The paper commands arrived, soaked in delusion. But the men at the front no longer obeyed out of faith. They obeyed out of habit, like machines too tired to stop. The narrator would have drawn the contrast sharply. The Wehrmacht had built its reputation on precision, on efficiency, on speed. But none of those things mattered here. The Russian land had taught them a lesson written in frost and mud, that the greatest enemy of technology is nature itself. As April dragged on, the soldiers began to call their tanks Eisenleichen, iron corpses. Some used them as makeshift shelters. Others stripped them for scrap, removing radios, optics, even bolts to trade for food. The machines that had once embodied the future of warfare were now tools of survival, nothing more. And yet, even as they sank into the mud, the German generals refused to surrender their pride. In reports to Berlin, they spoke of temporary immobility, of mechanical complications. But the men knew better. They could feel the war slipping away under their boots. At night, the steppe came alive with the sound of thaw, water dripping, ice breaking, engines collapsing inward as metal warped. To the soldiers listening, it sounded like laughter. Not theirs, but the laughter of the land itself. By the end of April, the frost was gone, but its victory remained. The tanks could move again, but the men inside them had lost something greater than engines. They had lost the belief that they could master the East. May 1942. The spring sun rose weakly over a landscape that no longer resembled a battlefield, but a graveyard of ambitions. The German army had survived the winter, but not without scars that ran deeper than flesh. What had once been a war of conquest was now a struggle for endurance, fought not against men but against the land itself. The narrator's voice would stretch across the frozen plains now turned to mud, describing a silence that no engine could break. Hundreds of panzers sat motionless, some half buried, others gutted by their own crews to prevent capture. The Blitzkrieg, once a storm of steel and precision, had been reduced to static metal monuments, testaments to overconfidence and logistical collapse. German engineers arrived from the rear to inspect the devastation. They measured broken engines, logged reports of oil thickened to tar, and analyzed steel warped by endless freeze-thaw cycles. The verdict was simple. The tanks had not failed mechanically. They had failed philosophically. The machines had been built for Europe, not for Russia. They were precision instruments in a world that demanded brute survival. The narrator would pause on the irony. The Wehrmacht had mocked Soviet simplicity, the crude welding, the rough finishes, the engines that rattled like tractors. Yet those same primitive designs had survived the winter, while German craftsmanship froze solid. Perfection had become weakness. Meanwhile, the Soviets grew stronger. Their logistics adapted to the chaos. Sleds instead of trucks, field workshops in every village, engines warmed by bonfires through the night. Red Army mechanics joked that the Russian winter was their best general. The joke, bitter as it was, had truth behind it. At German headquarters, maps still showed the path to Moscow, but no one spoke of it anymore. The lines on paper meant nothing when every road was a river of mud and every tank a coffin waiting to sink. The men at the front read the situation more clearly than their generals ever would. They no longer believed in victory, only survival until the next resupply that might never come. As May progressed, the battlefield took on an eerie stillness. Crows circled the wrecks of armored columns, their cries carrying across the thawing fields. In the nights, the thawing ground released the stench of diesel and death. For miles, one could walk among the frozen hulks of Panzer IIIs, IVs, and the few Tigers that had made it this far, each one a monument to the arrogance that had fueled the invasion. Inside their makeshift shelters, soldiers whispered the same bitter phrase, "Der Winter hat uns besiegt." The winter has defeated us. It was said quietly, never in front of officers, but everyone knew it was true. In Berlin, the propaganda machine told another story. Newspapers spoke of heroic endurance, of how the German soldier had tamed the Russian winter. But the men at the front laughed darkly when they heard it. They had seen the truth. There was no taming the East. Even as the weather warmed, the psychological frost remained. The soldiers had begun to dread the coming winter, knowing it would return with vengeance. They repaired what they could, patched engines, drained oil, scavenged parts from ruined machines. But it was a hopeless ritual. The damage wasn't just physical, it was faith itself that had frozen and cracked. The narrator's tone would soften now, turning reflective. Empires have fallen to winter before, Napoleon's centuries earlier, and now it had claimed another. What the cold could not destroy, it had humbled. And in that humility, the seeds of defeat were already sown. June 1942. The thaw had given the illusion of revival. Fields once white with snow now shimmered with spring grass, and the horizon no longer blurred in endless gray. Yet beneath that fragile green, the soil still held the memory of winter. Oil, bone, and steel buried just beneath the surface. The German army moved again, but it moved differently now. Slower, more cautious, its confidence shattered like the ice it had once ignored. The narrator's voice would carry a solemn gravity, the tone of history being rewritten by the elements. Where generals once promised victory before Christmas, they now spoke only of survival through the next one. The engines roared again, but with a strained, uneven sound, the kind that betrayed how close they were to failure. Mechanics coaxed life back into machines that should have been scrapped months earlier. Every start was a gamble, every movement a prayer. And yet the German high command pretended all was well. Operation Blue was underway, the grand summer offensive toward the oil fields of the Caucasus. Once more, Hitler's armies were on the move. Once more, the maps in Berlin lit up with arrows driving east and south. But among the men in the field, there was no laughter left. They remembered December, the frost-bitten fingers, the engines that would not turn, the dead eyes of comrades frozen where they had fallen. The narrator would describe the irony that history loves. The same arrogance that had mocked the first winter was already planning to face the next one. The officers believed that this time they would finish the campaign before the snow returned. But the veterans knew better. They had seen how quickly the earth could turn against them, how thin the line was between conquest and catastrophe. Even as the summer heat rose, reminders of the cold lingered. Frozen corpses thawed and sank into the mud. Wrecked tanks stood like statues in the fields, their armor streaked with rust and their guns pointing at nothing. Birds nested inside open turrets. Nature was reclaiming what war had abandoned. Supplies remained a nightmare. Engines wore out faster than replacements could arrive. Tires cracked, filters clogged with dust. Oil, so desperately rationed, was often thinned with substitutes that ruined the machinery. Every kilometer gained was bought with hours of mechanical suffering, and all the while whispers spread through the ranks that the winter had not been an anomaly, but a warning. The narrator would draw attention to the growing contrast. On one side, German reports describing temporary mechanical difficulties. On the other, diaries filled with despair. "We march on ghosts," one corporal wrote. "The cold has followed us into summer." He wasn't wrong. The psychological frost still lingered in every conversation, every order given without conviction. When Soviet partisans began striking at supply lines again, it was clear that the Red Army had learned as well. They attacked in the night, set fires to fuel depots, and disappeared into forests that the Germans feared to enter. The partisans needed no tanks, no engines. They fought with the land, and the land fought with them. By the end of June, as the days grew long and light seemed endless, the German soldiers could not escape a quiet dread, the realization that they would still be here when the light faded again. Another winter was coming. They didn't need a calendar to know it. They could feel it in their bones, in the distant echo of silence that came after every rumbling engine. The narrator's voice would lower, almost a whisper now, as if speaking to the ghosts of those who already knew their fate. The laughter that had greeted the first snow was long gone. What replaced it was the quiet understanding of an empire that had challenged nature itself and would lose again when the cold returned. September 1942. The steppes stretched endlessly beneath a sky turning pale with the first hints of autumn. The German army was still advancing, But the energy that had once driven it eastward was gone. What remained was momentum, the kind that carried boulders downhill even after they'd lost control. The men didn't cheer their progress anymore. They endured it. Every kilometer gained felt like a debt that winter would soon demand repayment for. The narrator's voice would slow here, tracing the rhythm of exhaustion. The tank still rolled, but every movement was haunted by memory. Drivers listened constantly for the faintest change in engine pitch, the telltale sign of fuel thickening, of oil congealing. The mechanics had learned to fear temperature more than bullets. It was a soldier's superstition now, the idea that when the first frost came, the machines would remember what had happened the year before. In Berlin, the generals celebrated victories on paper. Stalingrad was next, they said. The Volga would be reached, the Soviets broken. But the men at the front didn't believe in victories anymore. They had seen too much. The dead left behind in snowdrifts, the tanks frozen like monuments. They knew that geography didn't win wars. The weather did. As the nights grew colder, the same problems returned. Quietly, like an old enemy. Fuel pumps stiffened, batteries lost charge. Steel contracted until bolts snapped with sharp cracks that echoed in the empty fields. Mechanics worked with torches, trying to heat frozen metal, their faces red with reflected flame. It was a grim repetition of the previous year's nightmare. Only now it came earlier, more cruelly, because this time they knew what was coming. The narrator would linger on a haunting detail. German soldiers carried rags soaked in oil to wrap around fuel lines, hoping to keep them warm. They lit fires beneath tank hulls at night, risking explosions just to ensure the engines might start in the morning. Every spark was a gamble between life and death, between motion and paralysis. And then came the snow again, earlier than expected. Thin at first, a dusting over the fields, but it carried a weight that was more than physical. It was memory made visible. The laughter from the year before had become superstition, then silence. Now it was something darker. Fear. Reports reached Berlin about engines failing across the front, about tanks immobilized during marches, about units stuck for days waiting for fuel that would never arrive. The generals blamed logistics, terrain, sabotage, anything but the truth. The truth was that the German war machine, so proud, so perfect, had built its strength on conditions it could not control. Meanwhile, the Soviets were moving. They had prepared. Their engineers had rebuilt engines with new oils resistant to freezing, and their supply trains carried parts instead of excuses. The Red Army was no longer merely surviving winter. It was mastering it. For the Germans, that realization hit harder than any artillery shell. In every camp, there were stories whispered around the fires, of tanks frozen in place until the Soviets surrounded them, of men who froze to death sitting upright at their posts, of villages where the wind howled through abandoned armor like a choir of ghosts. The cold was no longer just weather, it was vengeance. The narrator would end this section with a growing sense of inevitability. The Germans had laughed once at the idea of nature as an enemy. Now, as snow buried their machines once more, they could hear that laughter echoing, not from their ranks, but from the endless, merciless plains of Russia. The second winter had begun, and this time, even before the engines stopped, everyone knew how it would end. December 1942. The cold returned with a vengeance that defied imagination. It was sharper, deeper, more relentless than before, as if the Russian winter itself had learned from the previous year. The steppe froze solid again, rivers turned to glass, and every whisper of wind carried 1,000 knives. The German army, trapped far from home and far beyond reason, was no longer fighting for victory. It was fighting for breath. The narrator's tone would be heavy, deliberate, each word falling like snow on iron. The tanks that had once embodied the might of the Wehrmacht were now frozen statues. Their crews lit fires beneath the engines in a desperate attempt to bring them back to life. The flames licked at the undercarriage, warming nothing but hope. When they tried to start the engines, only silence answered. Metal cracked like bone. Fuel froze in the lines. Oil turned to jelly. Hydraulic systems seized. The proud machines that had crossed Europe in triumph were now useless in the face of physics. Men beat at the armor with their fists as if rage could thaw steel. One lieutenant wrote in his diary, "We have the finest tanks in the world until it drops below zero." At Stalingrad, the situation was worse. The encirclement was complete. Thousands of vehicles stood idle, their engines dead, their crews trapped. Food was gone, ammunition dwindled, and even movement became impossible. The tanks that had once been weapons were now coffins, hulks of frozen metal that offered neither warmth nor protection. The narrator would draw the image in stark, painful detail. Men sleeping inside the tanks, their breath freezing against the steel walls, frost forming on their uniforms. Outside, the snow covered the dead so quickly that burial was unnecessary. The steppe took them without ceremony. In Berlin, Hitler still issued orders demanding counterattacks, breakthroughs, and miracles. He believed the machines could be revived by will alone, but no command could change the laws of nature. The winter did not listen. It simply endured, indifferent to all human authority. The Soviet counteroffensive rolled forward through the blizzard. Their tanks, crude, rugged, uncomplicated, tore across the ice while the German machines sat motionless, their tracks entombed. The Red Army's advantage was no longer numerical, it was elemental. They belonged to the winter. When the Soviets reached abandoned German positions, they found the tanks perfectly intact, their crews still inside, frozen at their posts, hands gripping controls that no longer responded. A few tried to start the engines again as shells fell around them. None succeeded. The great German war machine had finally stopped, not in defeat by battle, but by temperature. The narrator's voice would soften, almost mournful now. History often remembers battles, generals, and strategies. But here, in the white silence of the Russian winter, there was no strategy left. Only survival, and even that, denied to most. By February 1943, the last remnants of the Sixth Army surrendered at Stalingrad. Of the hundreds of thousands who had entered the Soviet Union full of pride and power, few would ever return. The frozen tanks remained, scattered across the steppe, silent monuments to a hubris that believed engineering could conquer nature. In the years that followed, when spring returned and the ice melted, Soviet villagers found them still there. Rusted, sunken, their insignias faded, but their story clear. The machines that once symbolized unstoppable might now told a different tale, of arrogance punished, of human limits exposed, of winter's quiet triumph. The narrator would end in near silence, only the whisper of wind across endless snow. They had laughed at the idea of winter as an enemy. But in the end, it was winter that laughed last, and Germany's tanks would never start again. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.